I own a lot of vintage audio equipment, but I've got some modern stuff too, and I thought it'd be a lot of fun. Let's go head to head between a Pioneer SX-1980 and a Peachtree Nova300. Sound crazy? Well, maybe it is, but here we go. I'm going to compare the two units in style and coolness, along with their functionality, and finally their sound quality. I just want to give you a little background on the Pioneer SX-1980. It was produced from 1978 to 1980 and output an incredible 270 watts per channel into 8 ohms at 0.03% distortion. This was right at the height of the receiver wars, and this is the most powerful receiver that Pioneer ever produced, and one of the most powerful that anyone ever produced. I completely rebuilt this Pioneer SX-1980, and I have a video up here on YouTube of the complete restoration for you guys who are into that kind of stuff. It was a pretty straightforward restoration. The SX-1980 is crowded, but there's a lot of slack in the cables, and if you take your time, it's really no more difficult to restore a 1980 than it is any other piece of vintage equipment. The 1980s have a little bit of a reputation for having power supply issues, because the power supply sits right at the bottom of the chassis, but besides that, they're very reliable units, and once restored, they'll run for another 40 years. The only way to compare these two pieces of equipment is for the vintage piece of equipment, in this case the SX-1980, to have been restored. Because if they're not restored, any piece of electronics that's 40 years old just is not going to operate as well. My Peachtree Nova300, I have less of a story with it. I don't have a restoration story, so there's not a whole lot of history with it. I received it probably a couple years ago. The Peachtree Nova300 is a nice looking unit too, right? I mean, it's a very sleek looking unit. It doesn't look that out of place, even next to my Pioneer SX-1980 that was built 40 years before it. But it has inputs for 2020, USB inputs, and a lot of digital inputs that, of course, the SX-1980 didn't have back in the 1970s. But it's pretty clean. It's good looking, as I said, and then also with this unit, of course, you have a remote control. But it's an attractive unit, and it doesn't, as I said before, really does not look that out of place with a Pioneer SX-1980. Now for the winner of the style and coolness category. Drum roll, please. The Pioneer SX-1980. Well, there's a surprise of the century, I'm sure, for you guys, that I picked the Pioneer SX-1980 over the Peachtree Nova300 for style and coolness. It's just a beautiful receiver. Have it on in your living room or in your man cave, and even people who don't even know what it is have to come over and take a look at it. It's got the cool factor over the Nova300. Nothing wrong with the Peachtree. I think it's very attractive, but if I've got to pick one of them, I'm going to be picking the SX-1980 over the Nova300 as far as style and coolness. There's no question about that. Now let's talk about the functionality of each unit. First up is the Pioneer SX-1980. Being Pioneer's top-of-the-line receiver in the late 1970s, it pretty much had every feature that there was. It had power meters. It had a quartz lock FM tuner. It would support 3 speaker systems. It had extensive bass and treble controls, supported 2 phono inputs as well as 2 tape inputs. It had cartridge loading adjustments. Besides that, though, it's pretty, pretty standard for the day. It doesn't mean there's not a lot on here, right? You've got your high and low filters, and of course all of your push buttons for the different inputs. It certainly was full-featured for the 1970s. And its biggest feature, of course, was that 270 watts. You know, you can see this massive heatsink here on the left-hand side, and there's one as well over on the right-hand side. But it's a big, heavy unit, and it brought all the functionality that the 1970s could bring to stereo receivers. Just an amazing piece of equipment. It's really amazing to me that not only was it produced, but first somebody had to think this up, somebody had to engineer it, and they had to figure out how to manufacture it. And so it's pretty remarkable that a product like this was ever built. Now it's time to talk about the functionality of the Peachtree Nova300. The Peachtree Nova300 is what I would call an integrated amplifier back in the day, but back in the day, you didn't have digital to analog converters built into your integrated amplifiers. And that's basically what this unit is. It doesn't have any tone controls, so it's like a line level preamplifier. It also has a phono section in it. It has a headphone amplifier, and it has a 300 watt per channel power amplifier built into it. So it's funny thinking about the digital to analog converter. I have some Nakamichi equipment. They're big boxes. One's the digital to analog converter, one's the CD player, and one's the digital audio tape deck. And it's just funny looking at these boxes that weigh 50 pounds apiece. And the chip inside this particular unit, which is a 32-bit 384 kilohertz design, the one that's in my Nakamichi, which was state-of-the-art back 30 years ago, is a 20-bit with a 48 kilohertz sampling frequency. So it's kind of interesting to look at that and see the difference. But if I were a young guy now, this is what I would be looking at. I'd still be into audio. I'd be looking at a unit like this. This unit has all the modern conveniences. I kind of wondered, I looked at it, I thought, well, why didn't they spend $5 and put like a one-chip FM tuner solution into this? It'd be just like with the digital analog converter. It'd be a one-chip dealie and they could put it in, but nobody wants that today. I understand that. I'm just kidding around, really. I understand nobody wants FM in their modern equipment. So this Nova300 has everything you need in today's world, right? Hook your iPhone up to it, stream off the internet. It's just built for today's world. The Nova300 has two RCA pre-out jacks on it, which make it interesting for me because I've hooked up my Dynaco ST35 tube amp to it. You've got a tube amp by Dynaco that was engineered and sold back in the 1960s, and you're hooking it to this very modern piece of equipment. So you got 50 years difference then, and actually it sounded very, very good. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, one thing it does have that the SX-1980 doesn't have is what? A remote control. So that's not anything really trick, but it's something that the old vintage equipment doesn't have. So there you have the Peachtree Nova300. And now for the winner of the functionality category, the Peachtree Nova300. I picked the Peachtree Nova300 to win the functionality testing because you've got all the digital goodies built right into this that you need in today's world. But you also can play those old albums, right? You can hook a turntable up to this unit. So it's funny how what was old is new again, right? This is a 2-channel amplifier that you can hook a turntable to, which is really cool, but you also have all those built-in digital goodies. Now let's talk about the sound quality of each unit. I'll be using my Definitive Technology STL speakers. The STLs are very efficient. Now I don't need efficiency for this test, right? Both of these units are quite powerful, but they work out very well. They're very neutral sounding, and I always use them for any comparison testing I'm going to do because I know the speakers very well. First up is the Pioneer SX-1980. I love the sound of my Pioneer SX-1980. I've owned this unit for about 15 years. I rebuilt it in 2014, so about 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe it's coming up on 7 years. And it's been nothing but a joy when I have it in my system. As you guys know, I've got a lot of pieces of equipment and a lot of times she's just sitting on the shelf, but every time I bring her out, turn her on, and listen, I'm always impressed. The FM tuner in this SX-1980 is outstanding. It's really very sensitive. The auxiliary, I use it as probably most of you guys out there use your auxiliary input for a CD player. It does nothing to disappoint. The phono section also in this SX-1980 is outstanding. It has an outstanding design. A lot of the performance of these units, whether it's like this one or any of the vintage units, it's about having them restored and be put up on a test bench, because that's the only way that a piece of vintage audio equipment can be judged. It has to be restored. It has to be up on a bench to verify that it's still operating correctly. If you don't do that, then really there's no sense of even trying to compare what something sounds like. All these vintage units that are 40 plus years old, almost all of them have issues. They just do. This is an outstanding performing receiver. It doesn't run very warm, but it'll warm up if you really are stomping on it for a couple hours. As y'all can tell, I really love my Pioneer SX-1980, but let's see what that Peachtree Nova300 can do now. The Peachtree Nova300, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of digital capabilities that, of course, the Pioneer SX-1980 doesn't have. And I won't talk much about those because it's very difficult to compare between the two units when one unit doesn't have a particular set of features. But I will say that it incorporates an ESS reference digital to analog converter that is really highly reviewed out in the world. So it's a state-of-the-art digital to analog converter that's built right into this Nova300, and it does provide outstanding streaming capabilities. If you've got any kind of a digital music source, the DAC that's inside this Nova300 certainly will work well. Another thing I won't talk about is the FM tuner, will I? Well, it doesn't have FM, so it's hard to compare to the SX-1980. But what it does have is a power amplifier section, and it's rated at 300 watts per channel, but it's Class D, with the SX-1980 being a Class AB. And one thing that's interesting about the Nova, which is how the world works today, the Class D amplifier modules inside the Peachtree Nova300 are made by a company called ICE Power. Well, it's a separate company, right, from Peachtree, as is the DAC company ESS. So this is the way the world works today, right, in electronics. You don't design everything from scratch like it was done in the Pioneer SX-1980, where it was done all in-house. You didn't buy modular pieces from different companies. These Class D modules have an excellent reputation. It's interesting to note that how much more modular things are today, right? You don't go start everything from scratch because somebody else is probably building it for you, and it's just more efficient and cheaper to go out and get something that's already built for you. You still got to take these modules and these chips that you buy from other people and incorporate it into your product. So there's still a lot of work there. The Nova300, just in a nutshell, sounds great. It really does. Class D's come a long way. As time's gone on, they've gotten better. And this Nova300 with these Class D amplifier modules really sounds good. It really does sound good. It's very open and clear, obviously a ton of power. I really have no complaints about it at all. It's got an excellent phono input section. I can see why it's popular, and units like it are popular in today's world, especially with all those digital features. I really like the Nova300. I could go back 40 years and see myself putting together my system with this particular unit. They're going to run you around $2,000. Give or take. So they're not inexpensive, but for what they give you a 300 watt power amplifier, they give you a preamplifier, they give you a headphone amplifier if that's important to you. Again, in today's world, a lot of people living in apartments and stuff, that's an important thing to have a quality headphone amplifier built into it. So it really brings a lot to the table for the money in 2020. And now the winner of the sound category is... We have co-winners in the sound quality category. We have the vintage Pioneer SX-1980 along with the Peachtree Nova300. Both units sounded so excellent. Whether you're into vintage equipment or modern equipment, either of these could be a centerpiece to your system. You may be thinking, how can a piece of audio equipment from the 1970s compete with a modern piece of audio equipment today? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the maturity of the solid state development that was going on in the 70s. Prior to this, in the 1960s, when people were first starting to engineer and sell solid state audio equipment, it was terrible. I mean, it was universally panned. Everybody was going back to their tube equipment because the solid state stuff really was poor in the beginning because they were learning. The components, the semiconductors were not very good, the engineering was not very good, and that's just how it works, right? In life, you learn and you go on and you make better stuff. And probably the first really good solid state audio product was the Macintosh MC2505. And even today, most people will say that's a good sounding amplifier, even though it was developed in the middle to late 1960s. So a lot that was learned in the 60s, like from the MC2505, went into a product like the Pioneer SX-1980. They had 10, 15 years of development to kind of nail the Class A/B amplifier. And by that time, they pretty much knew how to design them to sound good. And as I said, the semiconductors, the transistors were so much better than they were in the 60s that they just improved. And in today's world, you've got a similar situation with the Peachtree Nova300 being a Class D amplifier, and they're improving. But the funny thing about that, I was doing a little research, Class D audio amplifier, when the first one was developed in 1955. I was thinking, I don't know, when they come up with that, 1970, 80, 90, I don't know, but 1955. So that technology has been around a long time too, and it's just taken them some time here over the last few years to where most people are saying, hey, Class D amplifiers, they can sound pretty good. So the point is, I don't think that since the 70s audio equipment was developed, I don't believe there's been all that much improvement in what you hear. Now, I can't tell you what you hear. I've got my own ears, and so do you guys out there listening to me, and you got to make your own decisions. But the thing that I've learned from the vintage audio equipment, and I've learned from this particular test, is that a 40-year-old piece of audio equipment can compete with a modern piece of audio equipment in sound quality, to my ears anyway, and I think to most people's ears. And I think that's, back as I've mentioned before, you've got to service these pieces of equipment. They've got to be up on a test bench. They need to have those old components taken out, especially the electrolytic capacitors. Some of them have noisy transistors, etc., etc., and then put them head to head with a modern piece. And most people, I think, are going to say, man, that sounds good. The new stuff sounds good too. So it was hard for me to make a choice here. Which one's better, the Pioneer or the Peachtree? Well, they're both good. They're both excellent. This happens to be a Pioneer, but it could be a Sansui, a Marantz, a Macintosh, a Kenwood, a Sony. Can go on and on, right? There's a lot of different good brands. If those are up to snuff, they're going to sound good in today's world in a 2-channel system. Okay, I went through the 3 categories. The style and coolness, which I thought the Pioneer SX-1980 stood out. The functionality of the piece of equipment, where I thought the Peachtree Nova300 stood out. And in the sound quality, they both stood out. They were both excellent performers. The Pioneer SX-1980 is a wonderful example of what I love about vintage audio and the audio equipment that I grew up with. When the early 80s came, the equipment build quality went downhill quite a bit. He's around 82. That's when Dolby Surround came in, and suddenly you had 3 channels. Then you had 7 channels. I don't even know where it stopped. What? about 100 channels. But anyway, that's when I lost interest in audio, and that's why I find the Peachtree Nova300 so refreshing. It's a 2-channel product. You can spin your vinyl on this, and also you've got all the latest digital goodies to make this a centerpiece of your modern stereo. And so that's probably why I find the Peachtree Nova300 so appealing. It's a lot like the equipment I grew up with 40 years ago. It really is. It's just a modern version of that. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed putting it together. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a big thumbs up down below. And if you're not presently a subscriber and you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. And as I always say to my present subscribers, thank you so much for your support.